Okay, so I'm starting today's class. Again, we are at Block 1, Introduction to Sustainability. And today we will be covering units 3 and 4 in this, Global Challenges of Sustainable Development and Pathways to Sustainable Development. So what I'm showing here is, I want to give a comprehensive discussion of various aspects which relate to challenges and pathways. But first of all, there is a lot of academic approach to this that we have to understand. Okay, so our class today will begin to understand what are the global challenges in the context of achieving the sustainable development, not just in the context of overall sustainability as well. We have to relate it to development, and what are the pathways? How do we go about this? So what agendas can be fulfilled or not fulfilled, and how to get the proper pathway to achieve the outcome of sustainable development goals. So first, let us start with a very basic thing that I want to introduce to our class for discussion today. The first thing that we understand from our earlier classes, what is sustainability, how sustainable development is negotiated with respect to the needs and the limitations of the society and the economy. Also, now we are moving on to a slightly different context, a dimension that we have not yet explored till today. We understand sustainability inherently, but what are the dimensions of the sustainability? So 4 different dimensions have been derived from what we have understood as the 1987 Brundtland report, which are called non-negotiable primary dimensions. So the word non-negotiable, if you see here, means that it cannot be compromised on at all. Okay, so those are the primary dimensions of sustainable development. And those are, number 1, safeguarding long-term ecological sustainability. Number 2, satisfying basic human needs. Number 3, promoting intragenerational equity. And number 4, promoting intergenerational equity. So the 3 pillars, the triple bottom lines that we saw, are covered under these 4 primary dimensions. It means that safeguarding the ecological sustainability is one of the most important 4 principles which cannot be negotiated. We have to take care of certain ways in which ecosystems are sustained. The resources that we take as the natural capital that we derive from are sustained over long periods in time. The second most important thing is satisfying human needs: food, shelter, decent work growth, and reduction in inequality. So these 4 are very, very important, right? So of these, food, shelter, and decent work conditions are totally not negotiable at all. When we come to the 4th one, we primarily go into the next dimension, which is intragenerational equity, quite a bit, because gender equality is something which is very much ingrained in intergenerational equity. It means that even within the generation, different strata of society and different strata of people or humans, we have to have what is known as equity, or in the equity in the distribution of the resources, the opportunities, and value for life. So this is what is known as intergenerational equity. Promoting intergenerational equity, intergenerational and intragenerational, both are important, but first we have to ensure intragenerational so that we can also ensure intergenerational equity. So number 1 to 4, as you see here, are termed what are known as primary dimensions of sustainable development. So the secondary dimensions, they are actually derived from the primary dimensions. Very important thing about the primary dimensions is that the definition given by Daly in 2007 defines these primary dimensions as fundamental objective values, not subjective individual preferences. This we have to understand if we have to go to secondary dimensions. So here, fundamental objective values means every human being born on this earth has to achieve these 4 dimensions or imbibe these 4 dimensions so that they can contribute to sustainable development. It is not just the individual's right or individual's position to do that. It is also the collective the capacity of communities, societies, every society, every community, and every nation has to imbibe these four dimensions if he has to go through sustainable development in their own place. Okay, so it can be an individual, it can be a community, a society, or a nation. Now we see these are fundamental objective values. It is not just for an individual, it is not subjective to individuals' preferences. So now we go to what is known as secondary dimension. So the secondary dimensions are subordinate to the primary dimensions, and these are: number one, preserving the intrinsic value of natural capital, endorsing the protection of the environment, supporting public participation, and aspiring for an enhanced standard of living. So here you see, we have to preserve the intrinsic value of natural capital. Now let us actually take the first primary dimension and compare it with what is given here. We said safeguarding long-term ecological sustainability, which means that there is always a base investment which is made. So in that manner, there's always a baseline characteristic that the environment has that has to be safeguarded. That is the primary dimension. But to guard how these ecosystem resources are used in terms of services, we are guarding what is the value of these resources. That is the secondary dimension. I hope you're able to make the distinction, because I can tell you like an example. Having a lake ecosystem or having an ocean ecosystem is the primary dimension, where we are ensuring that the overall sustainability of this resource is maintained for several generations. But if we see, the lake has certain services to offer, the ocean has certain services to offer, we also have to preserve the intrinsic baseline value of these ecosystems over generations. So this is the secondary dimension, right? You can ask, is the secondary dimension negotiable if primary dimensions are not negotiable? See, the base aspect is that when we have this resource in hand, there are feedback mechanisms which can give rise to several different types of services. So if one service is dulled or lessened at one instance of time, the other services can pick up, and there will also be a feedback mechanism in the way that these natural capitals are used. For example, a lake can be used only for navigation, maybe at certain points in time, but it can be used as a repository for fishes and stocks for fishes at some other points of time, as fishing grounds some other points of time, or for, even in the fumdis that of Lake Loktak, you can see that they are also used as, the floating islands there are used for even agriculture at certain points in time. So the lake services actually may change over a period of time, but the natural capital of these resources, the base has to be maintained. That is the basic for the secondary dimension of sustainability, which is derived from the lake being in existence itself and the lake resources being in existence itself, which correspond to the primary dimension. So this is one particular example that I'm giving you. So if we have to also value the intrinsic capabilities of the resource base, then we also have to endorse its protection. So that comes next in the secondary dimension. It cannot be done only by government, or it cannot be done only by administrators. We need public participation for that. So supporting public participation derives its services or its capabilities from endorsing the protection of the environment, so that we will be able to preserve its intrinsic value. So what builds on to this line of inquiry is that we have to aspire first for an enhanced standard of living, which will help us to preserve the intrinsic value, protect the environment, participate in its activities, also take ownership of the environment, and to safeguard its long-term sustainability. So these are the very different dimensions that have been discussed in literature. I have put all this together so that we have a perspective of how we are dealing with the challenges that come with the sustainable development. So our perspective now is that we have certain inquiries that we have done, but you should actually see that economic growth is not mentioned as one of the primary dimensions. right? So we have talked about safeguarding ecological sustainability, satisfying basic human needs, promoting equity, but all this require investments and all this requires some sort of capital. So you can call it a man-made capital, and that man-made capital is what economics is about, and which is part of our three pillars of sustainability. So nowhere in the 1987 Brundtland report, economics took the center stage as non-negotiable entities which correspond to the primary dimensions of sustainable development. So there we find that there was some lacuna in arguing that sustainable development itself has been a little biased. Okay, so moving on, let us have this discussion, take this forward. Now, there were debates on the very nature of sustainability, as you can see. See, we are now split as to how do we see sustainability. We already discussed this at length the other day. Is it corporate sustainability? Is it environmental? Is it ecosystem? Or is it social? So those different types of debate fed on to the definitions of sustainable development itself. So when we come, the question comes to development. Sustainability is conceptual, but development is a practical thing. Okay, so when people are arguing about sustainability in the context of sustainable development, two different terms now come to the forefront. In literature, people have suggested that sustainability can be termed as strong sustainability or weak sustainability. So what does strong sustainability mean? Strong sustainability, the central idea is that the maximum development that can be achieved without running down the capital assets of a nation. Okay, so we have to understand from Victor's 1991 definition of sustainability as a strong sustainability, which means that it is actually the maximum development that can be achieved without running down the capital assets of a nation. So this includes, what are the capital assets? So this includes, number one, the resource-based capitals like the man-made resources, natural resources, which also include human, moral, and cultural capitals. So what we call as man-made capital, I have denoted that as MMC here. Man-made capital is something, a financial, you can say, a reflection of the actual natural capital base that we have. Natural capital, as we all know, is the value of the resources that are present by nature. Okay, in nature, without us having created any of those assets which are already present in nature. So a combination of the resource base includes the capitals which are man-made capitals, which are natural capitals. And now we make a distinction between man-made and human. Humans itself, by ourselves, we are actually capitals as in the form of human resources, right? So human capitals. Apart from this, there is also the definition of moral and cultural capitals, which help to safeguard the natural and man-made capitals. So the combination of all this is defined as capitals, capital assets of a nation. So whatever development we can achieve as a nation without running down or diluting any of these capital assets, that is the definition for sustainability. That those who prescribe to this definition, they are known as strong sustainability development officers, or you can say managers or scientists. So, but in the case of weak sustainability, if you see, Holden et al. 2014 mentions what ascribes to the idea of weak sustainability. It is overall stock of capital assets should remain constant over time. This is the argument that weak sustainability entrepreneurs or managers come up with. What they say, capital assets are there, right? They have to be reduced over time. This is something that it's going to happen practically. There is no way that it is not going to happen. And the reduction of an asset is acceptable, provided it results in it or is compensated by enhancement in the capital of another. For example, if we have a wetland that we are actually trying to remove, the wetland should result in a place which contributes more of man-made capital. So natural capital loss should result in enhancement of man-made capital. So at least this should, a very good example is setting up industries Okay, so we are taking the land that is there and converting it into industrial asset. So the asset that is generated there gives rise to more of man-made capital at the loss of natural capital. This is the idea that is central to proponents of weak sustainability. They say that this much sustainability is enough because we have other developmental goals to reach. So they say that reduction in natural capital should be equated to increase in man-made or natural capital. Okay, it can be natural capital also. Example is in actually the coast rainforests of Costa Rica. Okay, in 1800s they were massively reduced to make way for cultivation of banana plantations. In a talk yesterday, I was just mentioning the various aspects of the socioeconomic and the environmental implications rather of this policy, which the government took. The companies which actually took up the task of cultivating these bananas, after a point in time, they found that the loss of the rainforest meant that soil nutrition also went down. Over the years, after continuous cultivation over several decades, they find that the nutrient has reduced and there is no way that they can use the soil. Now they were actually asking the government to take back the land, and they had abandoned the land because cultivation was not possible, and they asked the government to take back the land for reforestation. And reforestation was done, but it was not very successful, and not much of the deforested land could be converted back into forested land. So this is actually a situation wherein the thinking was that whatever is lost in terms of rainforest gave employment opportunities and man-made capital to the population which thrived there, which survived there, and which was in need of development. So this is an example. This sort of understanding or theory is known as weak sustainability theory. So there are two ends to this debate on strong versus weak, which is on the nature of sustainability itself. So the people who support very strong sustainability, they are known as deep ecologists and ecocentrists. So ecocentric perspective means that the environment comes first than the society or economics. Very weak proponents, very weak sustainability proponents, they are called techno-optimists or technocentric in their perception. What they say is that technology should be at forefront of how we use the resources, and we need more technology, and we need more technocentric perspective, which places that as the at the core of human development. So the basis is that of the strong sustainability proponents, we have to really understand this because it's very important for us to know about what challenges this brings in to the concept of achieving sustainable development. So the basis for strong sustainability is that critical natural capital cannot be replaced by other forms of capital if it is lost. This is the basic definition or the basic idea. And it signifies that avoiding the combination of uncertainty of ecosystem functions, the irreversibility of components, and the loss or damage of these components, it is justified that we have to go with the strong sustainability at core of sustainable development. So what it means that ecosystem functions can be lost over time. Also, there can be irreversibility of the services itself or the components of the ecosystem itself if it is lost. For example, if all the construction waste is dumped into a lake and it gets converted into land where construction happened, it is irreplaceable. You cannot bring it back as a lake environment. So here the whole component, the lake ecosystem component, the whole component is lost, right? So if natural capital is damaged, there is nothing that can bring it back to the natural capital, which can add to the actual natural capital. And the third factor, there are three factors here. First factor, as we said, is uncertainty of how it will function, because the lake can get, sewage fed lakes. For example, in Bangalore, they can get deteriorated over time. Okay, sewage water fed, I should say, because the treated water from the sewage that is let into some lakes in Bangalore, where there is no water, where the lake has actually dried up. After secondary treatment, when there is no longer any toxic pollutants which are remaining in the water, this sort of activity is going on. So the functionality of this lake has been lost over time, but it can be regained in some other in some other manner, but the original water of the lake which was lost cannot be brought back. So there is uncertainty in how ecosystem functioning will be there, and there is uncertainty with regard to the irreversibility of the loss. On the third thing is there are people who actually turn against the ecocentric approaches most of the time, telling, okay, we have this wetland, how does it help us? Right? So that kind of a perception. So this actually, the idea of strong sustainability is that we should actually avoid the loss of the resource base for these reasons, because there can be loss, there can be uncertainty, and there can be eco-criticism. It's called eco-criticism. So to avoid that, first itself, the planning for sustainable development must incorporate a strong sense of strong sustainability. So weak sustainability, the basis for this argument is that ecosystems are there, they are present, and they are present so that we can use their ability to meet our needs. So the ecosystem's ability to the human needs need to be used. That is the concept. And this signifies that then there is a need for creating the sustainability constraint to designate the degree of restriction to which these resources can be used for economic activity. So this is a very strong consideration that the weak sustainability proponents should take into account when they are planning. That is the need for a sustainability constraint. We can say that if we have so much X expansion of hectares of land, we cannot use the whole X hectares. We can only use some portion of it, some subset of it, so that this does not turn into the land which is lost to us as natural capital completely. So this is sustainability constraint. How do we bring in the sustainability constraint? Is through data-wise intensive approaches. I'll talk about this a little later. So using the appropriate technology, and not just appropriate, but which is socially and economically responsible technology, that actually is the need for weak sustainability proponents, so that they can use this to meet the changes that they bring about to the ecosystem within the limits, so that it does not become lost. So this now discussion that it brought to us is that there are several debates in the nature of sustainability and different ways in which the perceptions change. Okay, so from deep ecologist and ecocentric perspectives to the best use resource use based capital perspectives, we can actually think of several ways in which this happens. So the ecosystem's ability to meet human needs is on one hand, ecosystem's ability, human interventions to conserve the resource base, the actual resource base, is on the other hand. So those two objectives have to be fulfilled. Now, if we move on, there are another set of debate on the goals of sustainability itself. So is the sustainability that we see narrow or broad? Okay, so here we see that narrow sustainability has one definition and broad sustainability, on the other hand, has another definition. So narrow sustainability is something that signifies development is not sustainable if it is not ecologically sustainable. That is the core component. People define narrow sustainability when ecological sustainability is compromised in the pursuit of economic development, as you will call, or a broader human development, as we can suggest. But broad sustainability is the concept which says that sustainability is intrinsically coupled with development itself. So there is nothing called separate economic development and nothing human development separately. So these two views began first at the IUCN's definition in World Conservation Strategy. It said in 1980 that the long-term ecological sustainability must be emphasized over development. So what this means is that if the resource base is lost completely, there is no meaning. We cannot pursue human development at any point in time. But the Brundtland Commission report, which came in 1987 after this World Conservation Strategy was formulated, it said That sustainable development includes sustainability, which is coupled with development itself. So here, sustainable development was defined in terms of the political, social, economic, and cultural dimensions, apart from the environmental dimension. So NICE's definition in 1991 corresponds to the concept of what we call as narrow sustainability. That is, development is not sustainable if it is not ecologically sustainable. But the Brundtland Commission's report, which led to the formulation of the Millennium Development and the Sustainable Development Goals, that definition is sustainable development has all the components of political, social, economic, and cultural dimensions, apart from the environmental dimensions, which have to be fulfilled to achieve the development which we term as sustainable development in the long run. So now we have understood there are debates on the nature of sustainability itself, and there are debates on the goals of sustainability. So moving on, let us now try to or attempt to define what are the challenges in face of this discussion that we have had right now. Okay, so in face of this discussion, we can say that the sustainable development that we want to achieve is limited by three different ways: by data, by ideology, and by intervention. So if we say data, in data wise, if you say the sustainable development goals, challenges to achievement of sustainable development goals are limited by the sources available of the data on comprehensive assessment of the goals themselves. And number two, which are the constraints from administrative or local scale on the monitoring and evaluation of this data, right? So those are the limitations from the data front. If we see this from an ideological front, it is limited by what we know as the frameworks or the policy frameworks that each of the governing institutions adopt, and the specific legal instruments which help in adoption of these policies in the long run. So they can be limited by this. The third way in which it is limited is by the existing area specific biases when the interventions are taken forward for their manifestation in the society level or a community level. There are very specific biases such as cultures, traditions, and norms or regulations, which actually plays a big constraint on the implementation of the SDGs. So if we see this, first, let us go one by one. Let us take data as the constraint. So when we have a discussion on this, we find that there is no nexus approach on quantifying cumulative success across SDGs. This no nexus approach is very much evident in many of the developing and underdeveloped countries, whereas in the better developed or highly developed countries, quantifying this cumulative success is done in a better way, which means that data is systematically collected for every SDG. The performance of the different sectors, the government sector, the state government sector, central government, and the local bodies, these are very systematically collected. But in the absence of correlation of these data with actually the resource-based estimation and the asset-based estimation, that is very, very important aspect that is actually not carried forward in many of the countries globally. So we have to have what is known as assets creation. Like I gave you an example of a lake asset, which is being created by refilling it with treated water, right? So this is an asset which has been created. But how this resource is maintained over time. So we have two aspects here: asset creation and resource maintenance across the value chain. Can the water that secondary treated water that is let into the lake, can it be as functional as the actual lake water quality in preserving the ecosystem services of, say, fisheries, right? So that is the part of the value chain which corresponds to the economic dimension of sustainable development, and it has to be established. So how do we establish it? Now we have an agency which has to look at the water quality aspects regularly, monitor this regularly, and say that this pH, this TDS, this temperature, this salinity, whatever, these conditions are favorable for fisheries. They have been maintaining the data on the changes in which the water quality takes place over periods in time, and they can say that the functionality of this lake has been preserved over this period in time, or it can be lost. If suppose we have a flood flood event happening, it might not directly affect this lake. Okay, it can actually, the sewage pipes that are let into the lake can carry extra loads of TDS or extra solids into the lake, which will pollute the lake. So in that way, the water quality can be affected. So if that happens, then the associated fisheries is also lost. So here the data is very important to document this. If the data is not documented, then it can, we do not have the approach that we can correlate this with other SDGs. So for example, water SDG 7 deals with SDG 6 and 7 are very much interrelated. One of these deal with what is called safe or clean water, and other deals with the production of sustainable communities and energy considerations. Okay, so the 6, 7, 8 SDGs, if we have to monitor them together, then the absence of correlated data, if we don't have the correlated data on the water quality, on the people employed to take care of the lake and the lake resources, and how the actually the energy component of the lake is satisfied by, say, they can have, nowadays we have flotational PV cells that many of the lakes carry, and they are able to light the periphery of the lake. That's lamps that are put on the periphery of the lake, so that shore development is also maintained. So these are different SDGs which are interrelated. But if we not looking at the energy considerations at all, so there are no energy infrastructure. I know of one lake which actually collects the debris and the leaves that are fallen and converts it into biogas, so that the lights around the lake shores, they are lighted in the evenings and the night. So that is one way of meeting the local energy requirements. So if we don't have that, then the value chain cannot be established. In that way, we have to understand the conforming protocols that are important, and the data that conform to these protocols, from the source to the market data, market to the consumer's data. So that is the whole chain. Apart from this, after the use of the resource itself, how resource recovery and recycling is established. That also forms a big part of the value chain, and that has to be established through appropriate data. Apart from this, what are the value of interventions? Okay, so this is also largely unmapped. In case, let us take again the lake ecosystem. If we have a system like whatever flood increase or decrease in flood waters or storm waters entering the lake, we have a system in place which checks this and does not allow excess of flooding of influx of the solids at any point in time. So that is an intervention. So what is the value of intervention? That increases the value of the natural capital, or preserves the value of natural capital, or enhances the man-made capital from the use of this resource itself. So that is the value of intervention, and that has to be mapped, that has to be accounted for a longer period in time. So if we have to have a sustainable development in place, we actually take some decisions for which we think that will contribute to the overall sustainability for a long period of time. This also has to be mapped across various strata of the society. Third and the fourth thing is that we have to actually also account for data on transformational technologies or frameworks which are actually maybe globally non-uniform, which means that it can be specialized for one particular area, but it is not used in another area, right? So it can be a conservational practice, as I told you about olive ridley. It can have a more of a managerial aspect, as in like having a regulated we have dredging technologies which are regulated, which open up the way in which the coastal lagoons connect to the sea. So these are actually interventions, and these are transformational technologies which are very important to preserve. But what is the data on that? Have they been used very effectively, or have they contributed to the overall sustainable development? Those are examples that have to be quantified in terms of data. So if that data is not available, this is going to be a constraint on how we actually evaluate the success of the SDGs across different SDGs. Second challenge is from an ideological perspective. Okay, so there can be a political will and support to implement SDGs, or political opposition to implement the SDGs, given the particular political climate in a country. This we actually very easily understand. We are all looking at different news items which come up each day, which shows that either the will is taken forth or opposed, right, at many, many times. And all this will have a repercussion on the way in which SDGs are implemented. So also, apart from the political aspect, we actually should consider the corporate versus the social aspect. So here we have, a push for suddenly using more of nature-based solutions, or, those solutions or technologies which support the preservation of the environment. That kind of a conservational push that many of the corporates are adopting may not be practicable in the long run. So for example, here we can have a technology, a corporate institution can adopt a technology in its manufacturing processes, which can reduce the amount of particulates that is let out. But if it is able to replicate this, not for a short period of time, for a long period of time, then it is a good approach, right? If not, it is just a sort of greenwashing that the corporates are adopting by themselves to show the people that they have some corporate social responsibility to adopt in terms of the ISO standards that we have, or the BIS standards. But in the long run, it is not really contributing to the sustainability. That versus the option of having green jobs itself, those industries which actually say we are actually, our business is, the core of our business is to develop nature-based solutions itself. Okay, so we have products which are actually nature-based solutions which contribute to long-term sustainability. So there is a differentiation between greenwashing and green jobs from a corporate point of view. That actually is an ideological pursuit, because as we already saw, there are weak sustainability proponents who say that resources should be used. Natural resources are there for using. Okay, they are not there for letting them remain as they are. We have to use them, versus we have to use them responsibly, because we are looking at long-term sustainability. So this is an ideological conflict which can actually reduce the way in which sustainable development is taken forth in a country. Second thing is about social movements which actually push some ideology related to sustainability for a short period of time versus a long time community service. I'm going to take the example of lake management. So here in Bangalore, there are actually high-rise building, where the human communities who are established in these high-rise buildings, they sort of adopt some lake which is actually nearby to their habitats. So why they do it is more of a selfish, maybe a selfish ideology, saying that yes, the quality of the lake has to be preserved because I have to live there. Otherwise, there's going to be an odor problem. There is going to be a flooding issue. So I have to manage that. I have to be part of that. So having that from a very intrinsic or an individual perception versus making this as a social movement, which looks at lakes as organisms probably, and looks at them as they have the right to inhabit this earth as much as I have. All the fishes living in the lakes have some the same right as I have to live in this place. So I'm just giving you an example of several social movements which can operate perspectives, versus taking care or ownership of this lake as a community service over a long period of time, so that the next generation of humans, they are also benefited from living there and using aesthetically or in reality as part of their neighborhood, as places for intercultural associations or social interactions. So these are actually community service components or community service ideologies which carry forth the same sets of activities but through different periods of time. So for example, creating environmental awareness can be a social movement or can be a community service depending on how the ideology is framed. Okay, so that is another example. The third example is actually looking at this as a life cycle assessment approach as a function of the corporate or industrial successes itself. So here actually the ideology is that the achievement of circular economy approach, achievement of resource recovery and reuse component depends on actual effective life cycle assessments. The ideology incorporated is that the corporates have to attain this if they want to successfully claim that they are adopting sustainability practices. So that is an ideology that is specified for corporate or industrial or actors or operators. But the essence is that as a function of the success can also include economic and financial success. So to what extent the corporates place these financial and economic successes as part of the narrative on sustainability remains to be seen. Finally, the next ideology that can create a constraint is what certification do we use to say that the measure of sustainability that we have adopted as a community, as a society, or as an industry, okay, is satisfying the proper limits for achieving sustainable development. What are the certifications? There can be huge ideological clashes with respect to what are the types of certifications that we can adopt. Is it going to be best use plans or best practices in this industry level, as we have seen? Are they going to be conforming to the set of standards called Indian standards that we use, or WHO standards? Do we go with the WHO standards to see that we are within sustainability limits, or do we adopt Six Sigma certifications? Is that the way to adopt this at even a lifestyle level, so that we can have lifestyle level changes and ideological changes which will help us to attain sustainability? So these are actually some sort of evaluations which sort of trigger environmental ideologies to conflict with how globally and locally and I would say on a nation scale, sustainability is actually pushed forth. And finally, another aspect is that looking at the sustainability purely from an academic versus purely from an economic evaluation point of view, this will create huge ideologies. We have already discussed this in the aspect of nature of sustainability versus how the sustainability processes are taken forth as narrow or broad sustainability. This actually can also change in context depending on the degree of success of these interventions, how people perceive these interventions. So if people say reusing plastics as liners for making roads is a successful intervention, but the roads that are laid are getting degraded in a faster way than the roads which were actually laid using conventional techniques. If they find that the degree of success of intervention is perceived to be less, then academically, individually, and economically, it can be perceived that the ideology behind the use of this intervention has failed. Okay, so that will have a repercussion on how people see the sustainable development measures that are adopted in one particular sector, say the transportation sector. So these are actually the ways in which there will be ideological constraints to attaining sustainable development, which also spills over majorly data as well as ideology spills over to the interventional part. So here, as I already mentioned to you, the conceptual versus practical implementation scenarios, they're always at loggerheads, because conceptual, we have a very strong understanding of what are the processes that can be done, right? Theoretically, these are the steps that we have to follow, but practically achieving sustainable development may not be effective, because at many times, most of these steps may fail. And that is not just because of science or lack of technology. It can be due to cultural, political, or any other reasons. So defining the target populations is also another source of ambiguity. Why we say that is, we have a target population for whom one of the resource can be more important than the other. But if the intervention that is pushed forth is for resource X, which the target population does not consider as very primary or very necessary, then the push for sustainable development is not very practicable at that point in time. So the ambiguity of the end user concepts of sustainability and their acceptance through different strata of society, that also determine how the interventional approach is being successful or not. So here again, as I told you, interventional model over ideological model, that will always create the problem, as in how conceptual versus practical implementation scenarios are reflected from this adopting each of these models. Further, even within local, regional, and global scales, there are biases. So we said that some society can, accept some of the biases well, and also build upon those biases using technology or further scientific activities to improve the kind of, the interventions that are in existence through policy making or other ways, so that it becomes effective to the growth of sustainability within their society, also contributing to the process of sustainable development in the long run. But there can be global biases. For example, there can be indices which say that although we think that at local level and regional level we are doing very well, global indices will tell us no, you're not doing well. So there is a bias there. So the bias comes from the fact that the indicators or indices that are formed, they actually use a set of parameters to assess the success of sustainability, which is different from what is used at regional or local levels. And at very local levels, we can say that we do not use indices always to monitor that. It is more of a public participatory approach and the outcomes, evidence of outcomes approach. We look and we see that there's evidence of our outcome or the intervention. That means success to us. But at a regional level, it will not. The definition of success is not the same. So there are going to be biases which are built in upon the interventional component, and because of this, it's going to actually create challenges in the way that sustainability is achieved in further periods of time. So now, actually, having discussed the global challenges with certain examples and the ways in which the challenges are put forth, I wish to go on to pathways to achieve sustainable development. Before I go here, maybe I can stop for a minute and we can actually have discussions if you want, or I can continue and finish the lecture and then we can go for discussions. What would be acceptable?
Harini, Dr. Harini, it will be good. Let us complete the presentation.
Complete? Okay. Okay. So moving on to pathways to achieve sustainable development in face of these challenges. Okay. So there are three different ideologies that have to be incorporated, not just from ideological perspective, but also practical perspective, because this is the convergence of intervention, ideology, and data together is going to help us overcome the constraints to achieving sustainable development. First thing is what we call as path dependency. So when we are defining a path to achieve sustainable development, we have to maintain that path. So the first step that we take forth will give us one set of outcomes. The second stage will be dependent on the success of the first stage of outcomes. So we have to ensure that the first stage of outcomes has been successful so that we can move on to the next stage. So this is actually called maintaining the path dependency. So I'll talk a little bit more about how we can maintain this path dependency. Second aspect that we have to understand as a pathway to achieve sustainable development is that there is actually robust domestic policy making process which is required so that we can have what is known as policy coherence and policy integration into the society. So this actually is very important because we saw that there can be challenges at local, global, regional levels. So we have to actually sort of transcend the barriers of local, regional, global, so that our domestic policy conforms to the global standards or the regional standards or the national standards. So that is a very important aspect which has to be taken forth so that the biases are removed. This can be only achieved by institutional mechanisms and better governance processes. So these three aspects are the pathways which spell the success towards achieving sustainability. Let us move on with examples to understand these processes. Okay. So there was this discussion that we had on our common future. The report there had several indicators and thresholds which are defined as the sustainable development's primary or main dimensions. Okay, so here now we bring in the concept of main dimensions, but let me tell you, this main dimensions includes both primary and secondary dimensions, as we have discussed earlier. Now if you see, there are 4 different criteria which were spelled out for as a formula, rather, if you can think of how we can actually evaluate sustainable development, or how we can evaluate the success of sustainable development plans in a given region. So the first one said that the condition number 1 was the per capita ecological footprint should be less than 2.3 global hectares. So this is actually the condition number 1. The second condition is that the human development index should be greater than 0.63. The third condition is that Gini coefficient should be less than 40. And the fourth constraint or a condition is that the amount of renewable energy that is produced and consumed should be greater than 27%. Okay, so why these 4 are very essential? Why are these 4 conditions laid out to spell the success of sustainable development of a region? Because number 1, when we look at the condition number 1, we see that the stress on ecological footprint has a direct bearing on how resource extraction is happening in the country. We are going to discuss each of these 4 in detail in the next few slides, but let us understand what their inference is. So with less resource extraction and better management, conservation is also guaranteed, which is one of the fundamental or primary dimension, that is ecological conservation of resources. Okay, so the first thing is that the ecological footprint has to be accounted for. Then we now move on to human development, which signifies that the quality of life is better for people inhabiting a region, and that it satisfies most of the primary demands or needs and many or most of the secondary needs. Okay, so this signifies that the people or the humans inhabiting this region have access to food, shelter, clothing, their water. Okay, so these 4 primary, and the secondary needs such as decent work, growth opportunities, gender, less of gender inequality, and better growth opportunities. So these are actually the part of the human development index, which we will discuss further. So this, with using low extraction of resources and more of conservation, moves us on to the next aspect, which is called something called Gini coefficient. So Gini coefficient actually is an indicator of decent work and economic growth opportunities. So it signifies that whether the employment has been satisfactory from the industrial perspective, as well as the individual perspective, as well as the societal perspectives. So here this is very important, moving on from needs to labor, from resource to needs to labor. And finally, to manage all this together, we want energy, right? So the better or efficient use of energy is signified by the amount of renewable energy should be greater than 27%, okay, in mainstream energy for a region. So here, these 4 components or 4 conditions were laid down to redefine sustainability as this can be only achieved if you realize that if we have better pathways to achieve this. So it cannot be singly achieved, or it cannot be, holistically or on the whole cumulatively achieved. It has to go through several pathways, stage by stage, for this to happen, for us to achieve sustainable development growth. So first I take forward the ecological footprint concept. So before we go to ecological footprint, we have to understand a term called biocapacity. So biocapacity is defined as the ecosystem's capacity to produce biological materials used by people and to absorb waste materials generated by humans under current management schemes and extraction technologies. So this very much corresponds to what is the ecological footprint of a nation, of an individual, of a region. So biocapacity can change from year to year due to some conditions. Number one is climate, number two is management, and number three, how they are used as inputs to the human economy. So these three factors change how biological materials that are produced in ecosystems are used by people very effectively, okay, or are they recycled and recovered and given back to the nature itself. So now if we see biological capacity, how it is calculated, if we consider that biologically productive land and water on earth in 2019 is close to 12.2 billion hectares, let us consider that as A. And the number of people alive in 2019 were 7.7 billion, that is we consider as B. Then we can calculate the biocapacity per person per capita is equal to A by B, which is 1.58 global hectares per person. So this is how it is reported. Okay, so all these definitions, this formula, calculation, everything is available in the link that I have given here. I encourage you to please go and read about this by yourself so that you'll have better understanding of this together. Also, this we have to understand that the non-human and wild species accommodated in the same area will also compete for the same amount of resources and same amount of biological material and the space as humans, right? So there is a competition. Given the competition, what is the biocapacity available per person? So this is one very important measure for us to calculate the ecological footprint. Now, actually, what is ecological footprint itself is, it is a measure of how much area of biologically productive land and water an individual, population, or activity requires to produce all the resources it consumes and to absorb the waste it generates using the prevailing technology and resource management practices. So ecological footprint is actually defined in terms of ecological footprint of consumption, or EFC. It is defined as the area used to support a defined population's consumption. Very easy, very simple to understand, right? So it is actually denoted, it denotes actually the area that is needed to produce the materials consumed and the area needed to absorb the emissions in terms of carbon dioxide. So whatever we have this greenhouse gases inventory, on that we have different greenhouse gases, but they are represented by carbon dioxide equivalents, right? So the emissions are always represented as carbon dioxide equivalents. The emissions are produced because we are using some biological materials to do an activity of value, which is of value to the human society. But in this process, we generate waste and we generate emissions. So it includes the land which is needed to produce these materials which are consumed and the area to absorb the emissions together. So these are two ecological footprint as well as the biocapacity. They are calculated as part of a national footprint and biocapacity accounts, which is maintained by every nation. It's actually a ledger of the nation's primary production. That is primary production in terms of ecological footprint plus the footprint of imports, right? Minus the footprint of exports. So importing also items, materials which were produced elsewhere has also consumed some of the resources. So we have to account for that as well. And since some of the materials that we have produced in our country is exported elsewhere and it's going elsewhere, we have to subtract that. So a combination of the primary production that remains in a given region plus that which comes in minus that which goes out, that will give the net ecological footprint. Okay, so here we see that ecological footprint. There is a map that you see here. In the map that we see that the measure of the natural resources, with this shows actually a measure of the natural resources which are consumed by humans through activities such as forestry, farming, fishing, mining, manufacturing, etc., and which are considered alongside their actual biocapacity. So this is very, very critical thing that we should understand. Here, if you see the graph here, the calculation for biocapacity, ecological footprint, and the net biocapacity reserve is shown here. So now we actually, in the box that if you see, there is an explanation for what this actually means. An ecological deficit, it is termed an ecological deficit. It occurs when the ecological footprint of a population exceeds its biocapacity. Okay, so a national ecological deficit, it means that the nation is importing biocapacity through trade and liquidating the national ecological assets or emitting carbon dioxide more into the atmosphere. This is a negative situation. An ecological reserve exists when the biocapacity of the region exceeds its ecological footprint. It is a positive situation. Here we see that the negative biocapacity, okay, it means that there can be a deficit or there can be a reserve. Now we are in deficit of minus 0.8. If you see that there is actually a color coding even within the deficits and within the reserves itself. Those which have reserves are called biocapacity creditors, and those which have the deficits are known as biocapacity debtors, right? So we are actually biocapacity of debtors of greater than 150%. Okay, and we have to understand that this minus 0.8 the estimate that has come up, it means that there is some lacunae still in achieving sustainable development. So that is what this indicator tells us. Now moving on, this is actually, are we very bad actually in this scenario? This is the usual question that comes to our mind. So I have put these two lists of countries where some of the nations are having biocapacity reserve and other countries have biocapacity deficit. Okay, so here you see Singapore is at top of the list, which has a biocapacity deficit of 10,400%. So it is very huge. Okay, although we say that, with developed infrastructure, when better work opportunities and better development, human development index, but the biocapacity, the deficit is very, very high there. So you can see many of the other countries which are more rich countries than India, and there are countries which are poorer than India, which have excessive biocapacity reserve. On top is French Guiana and Suriname. The percentage that you see here, 4,810%, is very, very huge. Okay, so India is in neither of the top or the bottom lists. Let us see where we stand. So now we move on to the next factor, which is the Human Development Index. So the definition for this is, Human Development Index is a summary measure of average achievement in key dimensions of human development. A long and healthy life, number one; being knowledgeable, number two; and having a decent standard of living. So this again is the UNDP definition, which you can check with the link that I have provided here. So how actually the summary measure is brought about is that it is actually a geometric mean of normalized indices for each of these three dimensions. The three dimensions mentioned here pertain to health, education, and standard of living. So the first dimension is health dimension. How it is assessed by life expectancy at birth. That is the measure that is used to bring about the health dimension. The education dimension is quantified by means of years of schooling for adults aged 25 and more, and expected years of schooling for children who are entering the school. Okay, so these two measures together give the cumulative education dimension. And the third thing is measured as part of the gross national income, or GNI per capita. So I'm not going to go into much of detail into GNI calculation, but I want to tell you that the logarithm of the incomes of the citizens of a country is used to reflect the diminishing importance of income with increase in GNI. So if it is high, it means that the standard of living is high, right? So Health plus education plus standard will give the geometric mean of these three indices, will give what is known as the Human Development Index. So where does India stand now? If you see this graph is also from World Bank. If you see that India's 1999 HDI value was 0.489. Earlier in the table, if you will recall, we'll go back to the table, the value should be greater than 0.64, right? So now the 2019 ranking of HDI, 2019 value of HDI is 0.645, which is updated on the website, and the rank is 130, right? So there is a rank change from 1998 onwards. Why I have taken the 1998 graph here? From that year, there has been a positive increase in the HDI for India, right? So here you can see the three factors, the dimensions are mentioned. The life expectancy is around 62 years. The expected years of schooling is 8.3 years, and mean years of schooling, at least every person has been educated at least 5 years in their lifetime. And the gross national income or GNI per capita is 2,504. So these factors together determine our ranking, and India stands in 2019, it stood at 130, which corresponded to median human development category. But in the world, if you see, the mean itself is 0.693 for the whole globe. Okay, if we take into consideration, life expectancy at birth is around 70, and India is much lesser than that. Expected years of schooling is around 12 years, whereas in India it's only about 8 years, which can have extended up to 10 years in recent times, and the mean years of schooling up to 8 years, which is pushed forward from the 5 years to close to 7 years in recent times, and the GNI correspond to 13.37, which is 13,371 rather, which is nowhere close to the 2,504 that we come up with for India. So here actually we see that there is still some scope for development and human development index, right?
Can I ask a small question, madam, please?
Yes, please.
Why are we comparing 1999 versus 2009 in the previous?
We are not comparing. I have updated 2019 rankings here, but I have shown the 1999 rank because in the World Bank website also you can see that it denotes the place where there was a positive shift in the HDI. Okay, so that positive shift happened from 1998 onwards. So if you consider values before 1998, the value and the ranking would be very poor for India. So the positive shift, if you see, there's a plus 0.008, if you see here, that happened from 1998 onwards. So from there, we have reached up to 0.645 in 2019. So that I have updated to tell you what is the actual value, existing value right now.
Yeah, thanks, ma'am.
Yeah, okay. So moving on to the next parameter that we were looking at, it is called the Gini coefficient. So Gini coefficient is a measure of statistical dispersion intended to represent the income inequality or the wealth inequality within a nation or a social group. So this is very, very important indicator for us to say whether there is equity and whether there is intra or intergenerational equity, and where the sources for inequality lie. So one measure that was originally used, it is called locational Gini coefficient. It deals with spatial clustering of manufacturing industry. So that to understand this, that is where the Gini coefficient was introduced. Okay, locational Gini coefficient it was called. It denotes the degree of similarity or dissimilarity in the location pattern of employment for a given industry, using the data on the locational pattern of aggregate employment. So when we say aggregate employment, it is rural versus urban environment. Even within rural and urban employment, we have rural male population who are employed, rural female population who are employed, urban male and urban female, right? So the calculation is, I have given you how the calculation is done here. You see the formula. Using the formula, data on locations share of employment and location share of aggregate employment. within an industry and across the industries, we come up with this spatial coefficient. Okay, so what it means is if the GJ or the coefficient is greater, the employment in the industry is no more or less spatially concentrated than aggregate employment. What it means is that the employment within an industry, there is a concentration of employment within an industry, and industry is driving some sort of employment opportunities, which may or may not be enough across the rural and the urban sectors. But if it is higher, it means that the industry is over concentrated. So here industry, we say that it can be manufacturing industry, or it can be production industry, it can be steel, it can be any type of industry, right? So for each industry, this Gini coefficient is calculated. So this actually gives an idea of where employment opportunities are opening up for a country, and where, if it is it placed rurally or is it urban. This is a very, very important indicator. So for 2019, actually, there was a drop in the employment of rural women, rural males over rural females. Okay, and there was a sudden increase in the percentage of rural women employment rates across in a year, but it fell after the COVID again. So there was a about, if they were say 90% of females who were employed rurally before COVID, that fell to about 40% of females who are having the jobs intact, because they themselves opted out. It can be an industrial sector, or it can be, service sector also. But the number of jobs which were available to the females and the number of jobs which are offered to the females, that decreased drastically post the COVID scenario. So this is actually the Gini coefficient tells us that there is over concentration of urban and rural males in the industrial sectors post the COVID scenario. If you see in 2011, India's Gini index, that is the most updated data, although we have data domestically, I chose to give World Bank data here for some reason. I'll explain. The 2011 data here tells us that India's rank was, index value was 35.7. Okay, so this is World Bank data. Now moving on to the energy aspect. If you see here, the percentage of renewable energy consumption in India is close to 32%. Okay, so this signifies that there is growing trends in production from renewable energy sources. There is access to clean fuels and technologies. There is increased rural electrification options, and there is combined access to electricity nationwide. So these four aspects, if you see, production of renewable energy, access to clean energy, rural electrification, and combined access to nationwide electricity energy sources. So India has actually performed very, very well in all these four sectors. There is actually 100% achievement of SDGs, which are related to specifically these four sectors in India, which has resulted in 100% rural electrification. So every village in India has been electrified. This is the official figure that has been given out by NITI Aayog. So here you see the consumption of renewable energy also increased by 32% than just conventional or coal-based or thermal plant-based power production. If you see, this is another statistics that is being shown. In 2018, as we already saw, it was 32%. Access to electricity, if you see, is 98% completely. Okay, so the access to clean cooking fuels or clean fuels, the breakup was 64%. How well the country was using technology to achieve energy efficiency, the country value is 4.4, whereas the global average itself is 4.8. So we are very strongly placed in this sector, as you can see. The international financial flows were also very huge, about 22,000 plus million US dollars in 2018. And the capacity per capita for renewable energy, that also rose in 2019 to about 94%. So the total installed capacity for electricity generation has a compound annual growth of about 7% from 2013-14. and the total installed capacity of grid interactive renewable power has also been showing a growth rate of 12%. So having this grid interactive renewable power has changed the way in which education and processes in rural sectors have happened over the years, right? So having a grid where the electricity is, distributed well within a region, that has improved the capacity and to have many more industries set up, and also access to many educational facilities, and also to use ICTs in rural backgrounds and rural households. So although we are classified as lower middle income countries, you can see our energy efficiency on the energy sector and the energy SDGs, we have been totally ahead, right? So are we sustainable region based on the 4 categories that we have seen? Now let us recall what are the values for India that we have discussed. We discussed and we saw that the ecological per capita ecological footprint for India was on the negative minus 0.8. For human development index, we were little bit ahead of the value that was specified on the condition that is specified as 0.63. We are just 0.645 in 2019. With respect to the Gini coefficient, the criteria was it should be less than 40, and we are little bit less than 40, the 35.7 or 36 actually, which is less than 40. And on the renewable energy side, our capacity has increased manifold, but we are using about 32% of renewable energy and consuming this energy in mainstream to take care of our mainstream energy needs. So this data actually suggests that there has been some sort of pathway which corresponds to sustainable development in the country, but there are also lacunae which does not place us very high on the combined aspects, as you see, from ecological footprint, human development, Gini, as well as renewable energy. In some sectors, India has performed well. In some sectors, there are still lacunae. How to overcome these lacunae, right? So if we see, I was talking earlier about, the pathways, and I said that I'll come back to this later. So the very important pathway to achieve cross-cutting goals. So there are again 2 ways in which SDGs can be adopted. One is by actually adopting cross-cutting goals and targets, and second is by achieving joint goals and targets. So there are 2 perspectives again. Let us see what this means. First, it means that if we are taking the approach of using cross-cutting SDG goals. For example, going back to our energy scenario, if we say that we have to increase our renewable energy, then we have to have the resource base first, which will give us, this renewable energy option. So we have to have that intact. So we are corresponding, maybe we are looking at land or water for these resources, which correspond to SDG 14 and 15, rather 15 and 14. So we have to also satisfy those SDGs which are interconnected to managing energy while at the same time saving or conserving these land and water resources. So those are cross-cutting goals. But there are actually some joint goals that we can achieve. Say we are actually, our goal is to improve energy efficiency. It means that we have to improve sustainable consumption production cycles in our industry. We have to improve the innovation and industrial processes in our country. So these contribute to different SDGs. So the targets of all these SDGs have to be jointly met so that we can achieve the overall or the summary goal of energy efficiency. So it is not just, cross-cutting, it should also be adoption of joint goals wherever this is possible. So going to cross-cutting goals, we have to understand that this corresponds to the nexus approach for a mutual attainment of goals. But nexus approach is a little different from substantive approach. Nexus approach means it requires the selection of procedural changes to policy making, which can set some institutional mechanisms in place to achieve this policy making and intervention towards implementation. And this aims towards what is known as policy coherence from an intersectoral approach dimension. So here the approach is intersectoral. But in the case of joint goals achievement, It starts with first selecting the policy changes which need to be better modified or reformed, and then approach it from a multi-sectoral approach, which will actually need changes to the content of the policy and changes through effected through institutional mechanisms or arrangements for formulation and implementation of these joint goals. So I'm going to explain this again in a different way. So the procedural approach means, in an intersectoral scale, it means creation of intergovernance committees. That means we are creating some sort of boards or governance units which can help us to achieve sustainable development. That is the first part. The second, what it achieves through this is a multi-sectoral approach, where there is institutional changes which are effected due to the adoption of the new policies which were created by these institutions or committees or groups. So that is the procedural way. If you take the substantive way, that includes at an intersectoral approach by adopting new policies or reformation of existing policies. There is no creation of committees or bodies or organizations here. It is just adoption of new policies or reformation which are carried forth and implemented through a joint proposal or a joint action plan. Okay, so these are the two different objectives which will help towards policy integration. Now I'm going to explain this with an example. So let us take the example of controlling particulate pollution. Okay, so this is our challenge to achieve SDG by controlling particulate pollution. There are several SDGs we can achieve. Let us take public health. Okay, public health perspective. For a procedural aspect, we say that the public health, okay, issue is a cross-cutting issue. It actually cross-cuts because several achievement of several SDGs can enhance the way in which the technologies that are used for production can minimize the production of particulates themselves. So there is a cross-cutting of different targets and different goals within the SDGs, which it means that not all of the goals can be achieved to achieve this particulate pollution. Several of the goals can make several changes through which the setup which actually creates particulate pollution can be reduced in an industrial perspective. So here we can create what are known as public health and air quality governance units, which makes these policies. They look at data. They look at data very keenly across very, very minute sets of parameters across different industries and manufacturing processes and units. And they say modification of this particular aspect will result in less amount of particulates being produced. And this will actually reflect in better health, public health conditions, as is evidenced by data itself. So having these data in hand, they can make new policies and which can be implemented on a multi-sectoral approach by the Environment Ministry, which takes cognizance of this data and acts as per the policies of these new units. Right, so there can be regulations in place which can ensure that the intersectoral approach by procedural means is achieved, which can help to make this policy a very coherent policy across all states in India. If we have a substantive approach, an intersectoral approach may mean that there can be existing governance units which can actually bring new policies to the way in which land and water resources are used, for example, maybe, or by reforestation mechanisms which can absorb these particulates. These can be policies in making, right? So what I'm telling is there can be a ministry, an environment ministry, and within the environment ministry we have different units. Each of these units can actually suggest measures which can actually together result in a policy by the environment ministry itself, which says that deforestation is a policy which can bring down particulate pollution on the whole. This is just an example I'm giving. This is not what we are actually implementing, just for you to understand. See, if that is the policy, that policy as a whole is taken and implemented across different industries and manufacturing processes, even maybe transportation sectors to produce low particulate loads. Which means that you can ask, how can reforestation as a policy affect transportation options, right? So it very much affects, because we will not be able to cut down the forest to make roads somewhere. So reforestation of the lands which are lying vacant and reduction in deforestation together can be a policy which can control how the transportation across a region is affected, and how that can, bring down the particulate matter. So if, for example, studies show from scientific investigation that some of the plants in the reforested area across the roads are not able to withstand the emissions from transportation sector, transportation can be banned in that, quoting the policy that was achieved, right? But if this can lead to a suitable integration across the corporates and across the society, then we have achieved what is known as policy coherence. But these are not, what I'm saying are just example scenarios. There goes a lot of data into making new policies, and very important policies come with more of institutional mechanisms which will help to come balance actually the economic and social activities together, and that is how a problem can be dealt with. Here, if you see, it does not stop only with having policy coherence, policy interaction. It also actually has to reflect on sustainable development in the form of policy implications. Here you can see an example. This is just a poster that I brought up. Here it says that creating a playing field and supporting growth of renewables. These are two policies, right? So the set of policies that are listed here, there is an X you can see in some of those policies, that is removing fossil fuel subsidies, right? And divesting from fossil fuels. This is not a practicable option. So what we are looking at should also be practical. We cannot do away with fossil fuels completely. 70% of our energy demands are still met by fossil fuels. So here we cannot divest from fossil fuels or remove subsidies for fossil fuels, but we can enact effective carbon policy, carbon pricing policies, which will bring down our use of the conventional fossil fuel based technologies and improve our consumption of renewable energy. So here the policy aspect is that the integration should be acceptable to the people. That is very, very important. And how this is done is through setting up of more, it does not just involve setting up of or coming up with coherent policies at national or state or city level, but it also includes a public participatory approach at many levels, stakeholder participation at many levels. It can be multi-institutional or it can be multinational also, and a private sector investment, that is also another source which will contribute to positive effect of policy adoption at different levels. So the organizational support or institutional mechanisms that also govern these aspects of how the policy can help us to transition from unsustainable to sustainable practices. So another example that I can show here is I talked about the electrification of the villages. Our estimates show that the last mile electrification for rural consumers using distributed or grid-based solutions can create up to 8,62,000 jobs in the near term. Okay, so this is a very important cross-cutting SDG option that we are seeing. And the MNRE, that is the Ministry of New and Renewable Energy, launched the Surya Mitra Skill Development Program in 2019, which supports the training of 50,000 skilled solar PV technicians. But is solar PV the correct option to pitch for? That is still under consideration because of the end use constraints connected to photovoltaic use. That is something that has to also be understood. So this is where the policy has to be enhanced, and policy implications will become very, very important at even grassroots level. Meanwhile, there are also initiatives such as the Sustainable Power for Rural Development, which are actually trying to commercialize the rural mini grids, and this can have positive encouragement in terms of ICT based, promoting ICT based education in villages. So we can also see that they will contribute to positive GDPs and also valuation of the social and environmental benefits. And what we require here is policy with respect to the micro enterprises, which relate to how energy is being used in the rural sector. So 11% of micro enterprises, they have expanded their businesses since they have connected to a micro grid within their village limits. And you can see that 13% average increase in their monthly average revenues has been recorded. So this means that the cross-cutting links of SDG 7 and SDG 8, the institutional mechanisms, as well as the policy coherence of the units which are associated with implementing these goals, they have had big successes, but there are also still lacunae, and those have to be carried forward in terms of actually having a joint proposal or an action plan. We can actually have a substantive approach as well, and try to reform the policies which will lead to better pathway to achieve sustainable development. So with that, actually, I stop today, and I hope that I have covered on the principles and outcomes in the last class, and the goals and the pathways in this class. More of principles and outcomes will always be coming up in the future sessions, which you have to connect to the concepts that have been introduced to you in the last 4 classes. And this is actually a very important discussion on more refined way in which sustainable development pathways are going to be discussed in future sessions. So thank you, and I'm stopping my sharing the presentation here. I'll be happy to take any of your questions.